Tonight, I will tell you a story unlike any other, a story of power, betrayal, and blood. It is not about strangers, it is about family. A father, once a pillar of justice, who found his greatest enemies not in courtrooms, but in his own home. This is the will of blood. Sit back, listen closely, and decide for yourself. What would you do if your children became your greatest Richard Hale had spent 40 years in the courtroom, wearing the black robe with a dignity that seemed carved out of stone. He was not the loudest man in the room, nor the most flamboyant, but people trusted him. His rulings carried weight because he never bent them for convenience or profit. In a city where whispers of corruption slid through every street corner, Judge Hale stood as an exception, a man who lived by the law as if it were scripture. He was 65 now, his hair silver, his hands still steady. In the morning, when he walked from his townhouse to the courthouse, neighbors nodded with respect. Children waved. Even criminals, when sentenced by him, sometimes muttered, "At least he's fair." But Richard's pride didn't come from the courtroom. His real pride sat at his dinner table, 3 children who had grown up under his roof. Daniel, the eldest at 38, had followed in his footsteps as a lawyer. Daniel had the same sharp eyes as his father, but he wielded them differently. Where Richard sought truth, Daniel sought victory. Claire, the middle child, was 35 and had built a reputation in the business world. She was polished, brilliant with numbers, and could turn failing ventures into profit machines. The Shark in Heels, a magazine once called her. Richard had clipped the article and pinned it on the refrigerator, pride swelling in his chest. Matthew, the youngest at 31, was the charmer. He never stayed long in one place, always moving from venture to venture, real estate one year, startups the next. He had inherited his mother's smile and used it to get out of trouble more times than Richard could count. To outsiders, the Hale family looked like a dynasty in the making, a judge, a lawyer, a businesswoman, and a son with endless charm. People joked they would be the next Kennedys of their city. Richard laughed along, even as he sometimes felt an unease in his chest he couldn't name. The first crack appeared quietly, like a hairline fracture in glass. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Richard was reviewing a fraud case involving a construction company accused of laundering money. The defendant's lawyer argued that the firm had backing from respectable investors. The paperwork listed shell companies, most of which Richard had never heard of. But one name caught his eye, Hale Enterprises. He frowned. There was no official company by that name he knew of, at least not in his household. The next day, he asked Daniel over coffee, "Have you ever heard of something called Hale Enterprises?" Daniel didn't blink. "There are a lot of Hales in this city, Dad." "Probably coincidence." Richard studied him, but Daniel's face remained calm, unbothered. Richard let it go. But the name stuck like a thorn. Weeks later, a reporter called his office asking for a statement. "Judge Hale, what do you say about allegations that your children are tied to questionable business dealings?" Richard's secretary, alarmed, shut down the call. But the words lingered like smoke. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He went to his study, opened his leather briefcase, and laid out everything he had. The whispers multiplied. Claire's company had doubled in value in just 1 year. Matthew drove a new imported car he could not possibly afford with his scattered ventures. Daniel had won several high-profile cases with unusual ease, witnesses changing stories, evidence disappearing. Richard wanted to believe it was coincidence. After all, they were his children. He had raised them with the principles of justice, fairness, and hard work. But another voice whispered, what if they learned something else instead? The turning point came when an old colleague, Detective Marlowe, asked to meet him in private. They sat in the back of a dim cafe, away from courthouse eyes. Marlowe leaned close and whispered, "Richard, I need to tell you something you won't want to hear. Your name is being used. Your children are involved in things that don't look right. Fraud. Bribery. Even intimidation. I've seen paperwork where your signature has been referenced as leverage, not forged, but implied. People think you're protecting them." Richard's throat went dry. "That's impossible," he said, his voice more brittle than firm. Marlowe's eyes were kind but tired. "I respect you too much not to warn you. Look closer." Richard did look closer. He began quietly, carefully. In his study at night, while the city slept, he opened financial records, court documents, and corporate filings. He traced the threads one by one. The shell company from the fraud case linked to another company Claire had acquired. That company had, in turn, funded one of Matthew's startups. Daniel had represented clients who mysteriously withdrew charges once linked to Claire's businesses. Each piece alone could be coincidence. Together, they painted a picture Richard didn't want to see. One evening, Richard drove to the courthouse archives after hours, where records waited in dusty boxes. Under the dim light, he flipped through case files and financial disclosures until his hand froze on a document. It was a contract, signed between a business Claire had rescued and a group of investors. In the margin, a note was scrawled, "Backed by Judge Hale's family." Richard sat there for an hour, staring at the words until they blurred. He returned home late, his mind heavy. Anna, his late wife, had always said he carried the world on his shoulders. "But Richard," she'd smile, "you can't carry your children's choices forever." He poured a drink and sat in the dark, listening to the ticking of the old grandfather clock. The shadows stretched long on the walls. In them, he imagined his children's faces, Daniel's ambition, Claire's cunning, Matthew's charm. He wanted to remember them as children playing in the yard, but instead, he saw adults weaving lies behind his back. The law was his compass. It had guided every decision he made. But what happens when the compass points to your own blood? The confrontation came sooner than he expected. Daniel stopped by on Sunday for their usual dinner. Claire and Matthew joined, filling the house with noise and laughter. They clinked glasses, told jokes, and spoke of success. But Richard's eyes saw cracks in the performance. Daniel avoided his gaze too often. Claire spoke too smoothly. Matthew laughed too loud. Finally, Richard set his fork down. His voice was calm, but the air grew heavy. "Tell me," he said, "what exactly is Hale Enterprises?" The laughter froze. Daniel's hand tightened on his glass. Claire's smile faltered. Matthew glanced between them like a child caught in a lie. "No such thing," Daniel said quickly. Richard's gaze sharpened. "I've seen the documents. Your names are tied to it. My name is tied to it. Don't insult me." Silence. Then Claire leaned back, her voice smooth as silk. "Father, business is complicated. Sometimes names get used for credibility. It's just how the world works." Richard's chest tightened. "You've used my name as cover for your dealings." Matthew tried to laugh it off. "Dad, you're overreacting. Everyone does it. Nobody's hurt." Richard slammed his hand against the table. The sound cracked like a gavel. His children flinched. "I have spent my life upholding the law," he said, his voice low and hard. "If you are guilty of crimes, bribery, fraud, corruption, then you are not just shaming me. You are destroying everything I stand for." Daniel's mask slipped. "You stand for an old world, Father. The law isn't pure. It's power. We're just using it smarter than you ever did." Those words landed like a knife. Richard stared at his children, his blood, and saw not heirs of his values but architects of his undoing. That night, when the house emptied and silence settled, Richard returned to his study. He opened his drawer and pulled out the folder where he had collected the evidence. The papers glowed under the lamps. Light like ghosts. He understood then what his path must be. He had judged countless men in his life. Now, for the first time, the judgment would fall within his own bloodline. And there was no path forward that did not break something he loved. The following week, Richard carried himself in court with the same stern dignity he always had, but inside, he was shaken. Each case file he touched reminded him of Daniel's words, "The law isn't pure. It's power." He had heard criminals say that before, men he had sentenced, men who sneered at the idea of justice. He had never expected to hear it from his own son. At night, Richard combed through more documents. He used his connections, quietly reaching out to clerks, old friends, detectives, anyone who owed him favors. He didn't tell them the full story, not yet, but piece by piece, a web emerged. Claire had been funneling money through subsidiaries that existed only on paper. Matthew acted as the front, charming investors, arranging deals, and assuring everyone that their ventures had the confidence of the Hale family. Daniel was the shield, manipulating cases, leaning on witnesses, burying evidence that might expose their trail. The three of them weren't just dabbling in crime. They had built an empire of lies, using his name as a fortress. One evening, Richard met Detective Marlowe again. They sat in the detective's cramped office, files stacked like towers around them. "You were right," Richard admitted, sliding a folder across the desk. "They've built something ugly." Marlowe scanned the papers, his jaw tightening. "This isn't small time. This is organized. Fraud, racketeering, intimidation. If anyone else's name was on these files, we'd already have raids lined up." Richard's throat ached. "They're my children, Marlowe." The detective's eyes softened. "I know. But you also know what comes next. If you don't act, someone else will. And they won't be as gentle." Back home, Richard poured himself a drink and stared at the framed family portrait above the fireplace. It was taken 15 years ago, back when Anna was alive. She had insisted on it, all of them in the garden, smiling, sunlight warming their faces. Richard looked at the image of his children, Daniel with his arm around Claire, Matthew flashing his boyish grin, and felt an ache so sharp it bent him over. What happened to them? He thought. Or did I never really know them? The law demanded impartiality. But blood was not impartial. The first confrontation after the dinner table came with Daniel. Richard invited him to his study under the pretense of discussing a case. When Daniel arrived, Richard laid out a file with highlighted contracts. "These businesses, Claire's acquisitions. You defended their executives. You buried evidence. Do you deny it?" Daniel's face hardened. "Business and law overlap, Father. That's reality. You taught me to win cases. I taught you to pursue justice, not profit." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, his confidence unshaken. "Justice is an illusion. Do you think the city respects you for fairness? They respect you because you have power. We're just using that power in ways you're too old to understand." Richard's stomach twisted. "You've used my name as a weapon. Do you understand what that means?" Daniel's expression turned cold. "It means you built a fortress, and we found the door." Richard's hand trembled, but he hid it beneath the table. He dismissed Daniel with a quiet wave, but inside, something had shifted. His son was no longer a misguided man. He was an adversary. Claire was subtler. Richard invited her for lunch at a quiet bistro. Between bites of salad, he asked, "Do you know what Matthew's been involved in?" She smiled coolly. "Matthew is Matthew. He plays at business. But don't worry, I keep him in line." "And Daniel?" She sipped her wine before answering. "Daniel is brilliant. He understands the world in a way you never could. Father, you spent your life clinging to ideals. We live in reality." Richard's jaw tightened. "Reality doesn't excuse crime." Her smile sharpened. "Crime is only crime when someone with power says so. Isn't that what you've taught your juries all these years? Interpretation is everything." Richard left the lunch nauseated, the taste of betrayal bitterer than the wine. Matthew, at least, had the decency to look guilty. Richard found him one evening leaning against a bar downtown, nursing a drink. His charm had dulled, his eyes were tired. "Dad," Matthew said when Richard sat beside him, "I didn't want it to go this far." "Then why let it?" Richard asked softly. Matthew shrugged. "I'm not like Daniel or Claire. I just wanted more. A better car, a better apartment, a better life. They promised it. I went along. But Dad, it's too late now. If I walk away, I'm finished. They'll cut me out, maybe worse." Richard studied him. For the first time, he saw not a charming son but a frightened man. "You're already finished," Richard said quietly. "You just don't see it yet." The walls closed in tighter with each passing week. Reporters kept calling. Whispers grew in the courthouse halls. One colleague even asked Richard, half joking, "Your kid's making headlines soon?" Richard forced a laugh, but his stomach churned. Then came the summons. He was called to the Chief Justice's office, a man he had known for decades. The conversation was short, brutal. "Richard, there are rumors. Your children are tied to things that could stain this court. If this continues, your name, and ours, will be dragged through the mud. You need to handle it. Quietly, if you can." Richard left the office with a weight heavier than the robe he wore. That night, he sat alone at the dining table where laughter once filled the air. He placed 3 envelopes before him, each with a child's name on it. Inside, he had written letters, not as a judge, but as a father. Pleas, warnings, a final chance for them to turn back. But he didn't deliver the letters. He knew, deep down, that words would not change them. Instead, he locked the envelopes away and opened his evidence folder again. This time, he wasn't looking as a father. He was looking as a judge preparing a case. And the case was against his own blood. The breaking point came at a charity gala, the kind of glittering event where the city's wealthy gathered to sip champagne and shake hands. Richard rarely attended such things, but that evening he went, curious, uneasy. He watched from the corner as his children mingled. Daniel charmed donors, Claire whispered deals into ears, Matthew laughed too loudly with investors. Everywhere they went, people greeted them not as individuals but as Judge Hale's children. Richard realized with a sick twist that their empire was not built on their own reputations. It was built on his. He slipped away early, his decision made. Back home, Richard stood in his study, staring at the gavel he had carried for years. Its wood was smooth from decades of use. How many lives had it altered? How many men had walked away in chains because of its sound? Now it would fall again, not in court, not yet, but in his own heart. He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Marlowe. "It's time," Richard said. Marlowe's voice was steady. "You're sure?" Richard looked at the family portrait above the fireplace, at the faces of the children he once believed incorruptible. "I'm sure." Detective Marlowe did not waste time. Within a week of Richard's call, a small, discreet task force began to assemble. They were men and women who understood the gravity of the case. None of them leaked to the press. None of them asked unnecessary questions. But every one of them felt the chill of irony. The children of the city's most respected judge were now subjects of criminal inquiry. Richard attended the first late-night briefing in a warehouse that Marlowe often used for off-record work. Maps stretched across the table, strings connecting addresses to companies, companies to shell accounts to Matthew's smile and Claire's iron grip. Marlowe's voice carried low but sharp. They built a network. Money laundering through charities, manipulation of contracts, intimidation of witnesses. Daniel covers the legal cracks, Claire manages the financial currents, Matthew smooths the faces. It's effective, but sloppy in places. They never expected anyone close enough to notice. Richard listened, silent, hands folded. Each word cut deeper than the last. These were not strangers. These were the children Anna had once kissed goodnight, the children whose drawings still hung in the attic. Yet the evidence sat before him, undeniable. Finally, Marlowe turned to him. "We can move now. Quiet surveillance, wiretaps, financial freezes. But once we start, they'll know something's wrong. Are you prepared for that?" Richard's eyes did not waver. "Do it." The first ripples hit within days. Claire received a call from one of her bankers, accounts frozen, transactions questioned. She dismissed it at first, convinced it was a clerical issue. But when the same message repeated across 3 different institutions, suspicion stirred. Daniel noticed unusual delays at the courthouse. Motions he filed disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Judges hesitated to sign rulings. Clerks gave him nervous smiles. It was as though invisible walls had sprung up around him. Matthew, less subtle, felt it fastest. One of his barroom associates whispered that cops were sniffing around. His grin faltered for the first time. He staggered home late that night, calling Claire in panic. "They're onto us," he hissed through the phone. "I swear, someone's digging." Claire's reply was crisp. "Calm yourself. Nobody touches us. Not with Father's name protecting us." But her hand, resting on the wine glass, trembled. Richard kept his distance, watching silently as the web tightened. At dinner one evening, one of those rare times they all sat together, he observed the change. Claire's tone was clipped, Daniel more irritable, Matthew distracted and pale. He cut his meat carefully, listening to their chatter. The conversation danced around investments, clients, opportunities. But beneath it all lay tension. The empire was trembling, and they knew it. Daniel finally turned to him with that sharp lawyer's stare. "Father, have you heard anything? Rumors? Strange talk at the court?" Richard lifted his eyes slowly, keeping his face unreadable. "Rumors always circulate. Truth rises eventually." Daniel studied him for a beat too long. Then he smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. By the end of that week, Daniel confronted Claire and Matthew in her downtown office. The skyline glittered outside, but inside the air crackled with unease. "It's him," Daniel said flatly, pacing the carpet. "Father's behind this." Matthew blinked. "No. He wouldn't. He's our dad." Daniel's laugh was sharp, humorless. "He's a judge before he's a father. Don't forget it." Claire leaned back in her leather chair, eyes narrowing. "If it's true, we're in trouble. No one knows our structure better than him." Matthew shook his head, almost pleading. "Maybe he just doesn't know the whole story." "Maybe," Daniel slammed his fist on the desk. "He knows." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of city lights. Then Claire spoke, calm but chilling. "If Father stands against us, then we treat him like anyone else who does." Matthew recoiled. "He's our blood." "Blood doesn't matter when survival's at stake," Claire replied. "Remember that." Richard felt the shift soon after. Calls from his children grew more frequent, too frequent, filled with subtle probes and careful questions. Matthew invited him for drinks, trying to charm out information. Claire asked for advice on hypothetical financial problems. Daniel dropped by chambers under the guise of legal discussion, but his eyes searched the desk for files. Richard deflected each attempt, patient as stone. He had spent decades reading liars in courtrooms. His children, for all their cunning, were no different. But their closeness pressed on him. Every word spoken carried double meanings. Every hug at family gatherings disguised a search for weakness. At night, Richard often returned to Anna's grave. He spoke softly to the marble stone, as if she could hear. "I'm fighting them, Anna," he whispered once, his hands trembling. "Our children. I'm fighting them because if I don't, they'll destroy everything you believed in. Forgive me." The storm finally broke with Matthew. Late one night, he showed up at Richard's door, reeking of whiskey, eyes wild. "Dad," he said, voice cracking, "they're talking about shutting you down. Daniel's got contacts, Claire's got money. They think you'll ruin everything. I don't want this anymore." Richard guided him inside, sat him down, poured him water. "Then walk away, Matthew. Help me stop them." Matthew shook his head frantically. "I can't. They'll burn me, Dad. I'm nothing without them. They'll bury me alive." Richard gripped his son's shoulder. "You're my son. Stand with me, and I'll protect you." Matthew's eyes filled with tears, but he pulled away. "You don't know Daniel. You don't know Claire. They'll fight you like wolves." He stumbled out into the night, leaving Richard alone with the echo of his words. The wolves indeed circled. The following week, Richard received an anonymous envelope at the courthouse. Inside lay photographs, him with Marlowe, him entering the warehouse, him reviewing files. Attached was a note, scrawled in neat, precise handwriting, "Stop, or the city learns who you really are." Richard's hands tightened around the paper. He recognized the penmanship. Claire's. He burned the note in his fireplace that night, watching the flames devour her warning. His decision hardened with the smoke. Detective Marlowe pressed forward, unfazed. The task force collected recordings, traced money, secured testimonies. The case grew thick with evidence. But Richard knew the battle ahead wasn't only in court. It was in the home, in the heart, in the fragile space where father and children once laughed together. That battlefield had no rules. One evening, as he prepared his robe for the next day, a thought settled in him like cold iron. The trial won't be against strangers. It will be against my own blood. He looked into the mirror, seeing the lines carved by years of judgment, and whispered to his reflection, "I must be judge even now. Even if it means destroying what I love most." And for the first time in his long career, Richard Hale felt the weight of justice as a curse. The news broke on a rainy Thursday morning. Headlines blared across the city. Judge Hale's children linked to fraud and intimidation scheme. Family of justice or family of crime? Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps before Richard even arrived. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping in a chaotic storm. "Judge Hale, did you know about your children's activities? Sir, are you covering up for them? Do you believe your family name is now tainted?" Richard said nothing. He walked past them with the slow dignity of a man carrying invisible chains. Inside, colleagues avoided his eyes. Clerks whispered as he passed. The courthouse, once his sanctuary, had become a hall of suspicion. That evening, his phone rang constantly. Some calls came from journalists, others from distant relatives, but most came from his children. He ignored the first dozen, but when Daniel left a voice message, his tone was sharp enough to slice through Richard's resolve. "Father, answer me. We need to talk." The next day, they arrived at his house together, as if unity could mask their fear. Daniel spoke first, pacing like a caged wolf. "You leaked it. You're working with Marlowe." Richard stood by the fireplace, arms folded. "The evidence leaked itself. You gave it life." Claire's eyes flashed. "You think you can stand above the storm? When we fall, you fall with us. Do you understand? Every deal, every contract, every whisper had your name attached. They'll crucify you." Matthew sat silently in the corner, face pale, hands shaking. Richard's voice was calm but implacable. "You used my name without my consent. You hid behind my shadow. That ends now." Daniel's lip curled. "You would destroy your own blood?" Richard met his gaze. "You destroyed yourselves. I am only giving the law its due." For a moment, silence held the room like a vice. Then Daniel spat. "Then we're enemies." And just like that, the line was drawn. The scandal consumed the city. Talk shows debated nightly whether Judge Hale was a hero or a traitor to his family. Protesters gathered outside his house, some demanding his resignation, others demanding mercy for his children. Inside the storm, Richard pressed forward. Marlowe's team built their case with relentless precision: financial records, wiretapped calls, witness statements. Every piece of evidence drew the noose tighter around the Hale siblings. But the children did not sit idle. Claire hired her own investigators, digging for dirt on Richard's past. Old rulings, questionable connections, anything that could stain his reputation. Soon, whispers of bias in Judge Hale's past cases circulated through the press. Daniel manipulated legal channels, filing motions, delaying proceedings, exploiting every loophole. He even attempted to use his father's colleagues to pressure the court into recusal. Matthew, caught in the middle, spiraled further into guilt. He drank heavily, his charm fading, his voice breaking when he called Richard one night. "Dad," he whispered, "I can't keep up with them. They're planning something worse. Something to destroy you." Richard's chest tightened. "Tell me, Matthew. Tell me everything." But Matthew only cried, muttered apologies, and hung up. The first courtroom clash arrived not as a trial, but as a hearing. Daniel himself represented his siblings, standing with polished arrogance against Marlowe's team. Richard sat in the gallery, watching silently as the son he once taught to read cross-examined witnesses with venom. Daniel turned the courtroom into theater, questioning motives, painting Marlowe's task force as corrupt, suggesting the entire case was a political smear against the Hale family. He was brilliant, ruthless, his words as sharp as knives. But the evidence was heavier than rhetoric. Bank records, recordings, testimonies, piece by piece, the truth pressed forward. Richard watched Claire's composure crack for the first time as audio played of her threatening a business partner. He saw Matthew bury his face in his hands when documents revealed millions laundered through fake charities. And he watched Daniel, who never flinched, who smiled even as the walls closed in, his eyes burning with the fire of defiance. After the hearing, reporters mobbed Richard again. This time, one shouted a question that pierced deeper than the rest. "Judge Hale, are you a father first or a judge first?" Richard paused on the courthouse steps, rain dripping from his hat brim. He looked directly at the cameras and said, voice steady, "I am a servant of justice first. Even when justice demands the highest price." The words rippled across headlines within the hour. Supporters hailed him as incorruptible, Critics condemned him as heartless. But to Richard, they were not words for the public. They were words for his children. That night, Matthew appeared at his door again, soaked from the rain, trembling. "I can't keep this up," he said, collapsing into a chair. "Daniel, Claire, they're planning to bury you. If they go down, they'll take you with them. They've already dug up files, cases you ruled decades ago. They'll claim you bent the law for friends, for favors." Richard's stomach knotted. He had ruled with fairness all his life, but no judge's record was spotless. There were always gray areas, choices made with imperfect knowledge. Twisted the right way, they could look damning. "Matthew," Richard said softly, "you can still make this right. Testify. Help Marlowe. The law will protect you." But Matthew shook his head violently. "You don't understand. Daniel says blood is everything. He'll never forgive me. Neither will Claire. If I betray them, I'm dead to this family." Richard's voice cracked, just slightly. "You're already losing your family, son. Don't lose yourself too." Matthew stared at him with hollow eyes, then left without answering. The following week, the siblings struck back. A sensational article hit the press. Judge Hale's questionable past. Did he bend justice for allies? The piece cited old cases, anonymous sources, even rumors of hidden deals. Much of it was exaggeration, some outright lies, but enough was true to sting. Overnight, Richard's reputation wavered. Protesters doubled outside his home, this time shouting for his resignation. Colleagues grew colder, distant. The Chief Justice summoned him again, the conversation terse. "Richard, the court cannot survive scandal upon scandal. If this continues, you may be asked to step down." Richard left the office heavy-hearted. His children had done more than taint their own names. They were dragging him into the mud with them, clawing at the very foundation he had built. Yet even as despair pressed against him, he felt a stubborn fire ignite. If they wanted war, they would have it. That night, he stood at Anna's grave again, rain streaking down his coat. "They're not the children we raised," he whispered. "But I will face them. For the law. For the truth. For you." And for the first time, he no longer spoke as a father. He spoke as a judge preparing for the harshest trial of his life. The courthouse felt different once the trial began. It was no longer the place Richard had served with steady hands and solemn vows. It was now an arena. Reporters filled every row of benches, cameras crowded the steps, and strangers waited in lines that curled around the block. The case had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a family torn apart, a judge versus his own blood. The public craved every detail. Richard entered quietly on the first day, dressed in black, his posture stiff with dignity. He sat not at the bench, where he had presided for decades, but in the gallery, a spectator to the unraveling of his family. At the defense table sat his children. Daniel led, confident and sharp in a tailored suit, acting as both attorney and son accused. Claire wore steel in her eyes, her lips tight, daring the world to challenge her. Matthew slumped, pale, wringing his hands, a ghost among the living. Across from them stood Marlowe and his team, papers stacked high, faces hard with purpose. When the judge entered, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." For Richard, it felt like standing not just for law but for judgment itself. The prosecution opened with methodical clarity. Marlowe's voice carried steady across the room. "This case is not about ambition. It is about betrayal. These defendants, children of a respected man, abused his name, forged his reputation, and constructed a web of fraud that preyed upon trust. The evidence will show their deliberate deceit, their threats, and their calculated theft." Daniel smirked. When his turn came, he rose with practiced poise. This case is about envy. My siblings and I pursued success. We used legal avenues, business ventures, and agreements. The government, led by Mr. Marlowe, has twisted our ambition into crime. And who feeds this witch hunt? My father, a man who cannot bear that his children outshone him. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel had not just drawn a line, he had set the court ablaze. The days that followed were a storm of evidence and testimony. Witnesses came forth, describing threats, deals, and fraud. One man, trembling, recounted how Claire cornered him in his office, promising ruin if he spoke out. Documents were displayed showing Matthew's name on shell companies used to launder money. Audio recordings played, Daniel's voice cold and commanding, arranging false contracts. Each piece tightened the web. But the defense struck back viciously. Daniel cross-examined with brilliance and cruelty, turning witnesses inside out. He accused them of lying for profit, for safety, for revenge. Claire whispered strategies into his ear, her eyes never leaving Marlowe. Matthew remained silent, a shadow drowning in his own guilt. Then came the most painful moment. Richard himself was called to testify. He walked to the stand slowly, each step echoing like thunder. Sworn in, he sat, staring across the courtroom at the three faces he had once loved more than anything in the world. Marlowe began. Judge Hale, when did you first suspect wrongdoing tied to your family? Richard's voice was steady. When inconsistencies appeared in financial dealings. When witnesses spoke my name in contexts I had never touched. I investigated. The evidence led not to strangers, but to my own children. He paused, his throat tightening. It was the greatest betrayal of my life. The room hung silent, the words a hammer blow. Then Daniel rose, smiling thinly. Father, he said, addressing him not as a witness but as prey, you claim betrayal. Yet haven't you betrayed us? Did you not sacrifice family at the altar of your career? Weren't we raised under the shadow of your robe, always second to your precious law? Richard met his gaze, unflinching. I gave you love. I gave you guidance. What you chose to do with it was yours alone. Daniel's voice grew sharp. So you admit your children are criminals, and you, Judge Hale, were powerless to raise them otherwise? Gasps filled the room. The trap was clear: tarnish Richard as a failed father, weaken his testimony. Richard's reply was quiet, but it cut through the chamber like steel. I am not here as a father. I am here as a man who speaks the truth. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order. But the tension hung like a noose. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the old gavel on his desk. The phone rang. It was Matthew. Dad, his voice shook. I can't take it anymore. Daniel, he doesn't care who burns, as long as he wins. Claire too. But his words broke. I never wanted this. I signed what they told me to sign. I said yes because I was weak. I don't know how to get out. Richard closed his eyes. There is one way, Matthew. Testify. Tell the truth. A silence, broken by sobbing. Then Matthew whispered, if I do, I'll lose them forever. Richard's voice softened. You already lost them the moment they chose lies over family. Save yourself, son. Save what's left of us. The line went quiet. Then a faint, I'll think about it. The next day, Matthew entered the courtroom looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes avoided Daniel's, avoided Claire's. When Marlowe called him to the stand, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Daniel leapt to his feet. Objection. Conflict of interest. The judge overruled. Matthew swore in, his voice trembling. Marlowe asked gently, "Matthew, did you participate in the scheme your siblings created?" Matthew's lips quivered. He glanced at Daniel, whose eyes burned with warning, then at Claire, whose face was stone. He looked at Richard, who gave the smallest nod, a father's silent plea. Finally, Matthew whispered, "Yes, I did. But not willingly. They pressured me. They forged. They threatened. I was weak, but I wasn't the architect. Daniel and Claire, they orchestrated everything." The room exploded in gasps. Daniel slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Liar." Claire's mask cracked, her face twisting with fury. But Matthew kept speaking, tears streaming. "I wanted out. I wanted no part of it. But they said if I betrayed them, I'd be finished. And they used Father's name, his legacy, because they knew it would shield them. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Richard sat frozen, torn between sorrow and relief. His son had finally spoken the truth, but the cost was brutal. By the end of the day, the tide had shifted. The prosecution's case was stronger than ever. Public opinion turned sharply against Daniel and Claire. But Richard felt no victory. He left the courthouse with the image of Matthew's broken face burned into his mind. Justice was coming. But justice, he realized, could break more than chains. It could break blood. The courthouse air grew heavier as the trial entered its final stretch. Weeks of testimony had torn through the facade of success Daniel and Claire built. Documents proved fraudulent signatures. Financial records traced stolen funds. Witnesses pointed again and again toward manipulation and coercion. But nothing shifted the tide more than Matthew's confession. His tears had cracked the wall of silence. Now, every eye saw Daniel and Claire not as ambitious professionals, but as predators who weaponized their family's honor. Still, Daniel fought like a cornered animal. On the third week, he cross-examined Matthew with venom. "You claim we pressured you. Tell this court why you signed those papers if you knew they were wrong. Tell us why you cashed the checks. Tell us why you stayed silent for years. Isn't the truth that you enjoyed the profits and now you're lying to save yourself?" Matthew's lips trembled. "I was weak. I was scared of you. You're my brother. I wanted to believe you wouldn't let it go too far." Daniel sneered. "Weak or greedy? You always envied me, Matthew. Always wanted my place. And now you see your chance." The judge intervened, but the damage was done. The courtroom had witnessed not just brother against brother, but the cruelty of Daniel's manipulation laid bare. Claire, too, cracked. When Marlowe confronted her with bank transfers in her name, she faltered for the first time. I don't recall," she muttered, her eyes darting. "It wasn't me. Daniel handled everything." The alliance between siblings shattered in real time. The closing arguments framed the story starkly. Marlowe stood tall, voice sharp. "This case began as fraud. But it is more. It is the collapse of a family under greed. Judge Hale's children chose ambition over truth, profit over blood. Their own brother confirmed it. Their own records prove it. Justice demands accountability." Daniel's closing rang with fire, but desperation bled through. "They call us criminals. But I say this is revenge. A father jealous of his children's success, a prosecutor hungry for headlines, a weak brother who chose betrayal. Do not convict us for ambition. Do not condemn us for being stronger than the man who raised us." Silence followed, broken only by the gavel. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Richard waited in agonizing quiet, torn between duty and despair. Finally, the verdict arrived. On charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, guilty. The words rang like a funeral bell. Daniel clenched his fists, rage burning in his eyes. Claire collapsed into her chair, her mask of steel crumbling into tears. Matthew wept openly, though his sentence would be lighter for his cooperation. The gavel struck. Justice had spoken. Months passed. The world moved on, but Richard lived in the ruins of a family divided. Daniel received 20 years. Claire 12. Matthew 3, with parole possible sooner. The press called it the trial of blood. Books were written, interviews aired, scholars dissected the case. To the world, it was scandal. To Richard, it was grief. He visited Matthew often, their bond fragile but real. "I want to change," Matthew said one day, eyes hollow but sincere. "I want to rebuild." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You still can." Daniel refused all contact. In prison, he built walls of hatred, blaming his father for his fall. Claire, too, turned cold, her letters venomous, accusing Richard of betrayal. Richard bore it all quietly. He walked the streets, still respected, yet shadowed by whispers. People bowed their heads to him, not in reverence, but in pity. At night, he sat in his study, staring at the gavel he no longer wielded. He replayed the trial again and again. Could he have saved them? Could he have prevented the hunger that consumed his children? He never found an answer. Years later, when Matthew was released, Richard was waiting outside the gates. They embraced, both older, both scarred. "Father," Matthew whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Richard's voice cracked. "You don't need to deserve it. You just need to live it." They walked into the sunlight together, two survivors of a war no one had truly won. Daniel and Claire remained behind bars, their names etched forever in shame. Richard carried the weight of their choices until his last breath. And when he died, the town remembered him not as the judge who punished his children, but as the man who chose truth when lies might have been easier. The family's legacy shattered, yet one truth endured: justice had cost him everything, but it had also preserved the law he served.